Welcome to Masters of Product Management, powered by Sequent Learning Networks, a show that provides extraordinary insights for product managers who want to go faster and farther in their product management careers.
Hello, this is JJ Rory, Vice President at Sequent Learning Networks. In our Masters of Product Management podcast, we tap into the experiences of people who work in and around product management to help you learn and grow in your product management career. Anyone who has been in product management knows that a timeline is part of everyday life. One of the first questions that gets asked when an idea or an activity is suggested is, when will it be done? How long will it take? What's the due date? Or where's your roadmap with all of your product activities over the next quarter or the next year? Frankly, it's hard for a lot of people to imagine not living in this timeline-driven world. But why? Why are timelines so important? More often than not, they're really arbitrary and not tied to any real customer or market need. It's not to say we should just take our sweet time and be lackadaisical. We still need to meet customer needs in a timely manner and beat the competition, right? We need to provide value. But are timelines, in their traditional sense, the proper means to that end? I'm not sure they are. So I have an incredible guest today to chat with me about this topic. Janna Bastow is co-founder of Mind the Product and also co-founder and CEO of ProdPad, software that helps product managers every day plan and deliver better products. Janna, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me here today.
So being attached to a timeline, as I said, is so much a part of business lore. You know, the proverbial water cooler or customer's king poster on the wall. I mean, we've all been in those kinds of environments, right? Why is the timeline-driven world so important to business and product? And why is it wrong?
Right. Well, I think it's important to look back on how we got here. And I think it's because of our addiction to the release planner, right? And the release planner is an important document, but what it's basically doing is planning out our short-term work. And so it starts off with us being able to say, well, here's the work that's coming out in the short term. And if you take a look at a release plan, you can see things coming out in this sprint or the next sprint and the next sprint after that. And what tends to happen is execs, people in the business, want to know what's happening in the sprint after that, and the sprint after that, and the sprint after that. And it's not easy for product managers, particularly if you go back some time, it's not easy for product managers way back then to push back and say, hey, we don't know, right? And so what tends to happen is product managers make up those dates. They add more and more buffer to their roadmap and sort of come up with dates that they put on that roadmap, and they end up being held accountable to these dates. And so the timeline roadmap became this thing that became almost this over-bloated release planner, which might have served a purpose as a short-term project plan, but just absolutely broke things when he started trying to use it as a 1-2 year planner of all the features and things to do. And really, I think companies are addicted to it because it's a bit of a comfort blanket for companies. Right? If you're running a business, there's nothing more comforting than somebody in your business telling you, here's a list of all the things we're going to deliver and when. Now, whether or not you actually believe that they're going to deliver that or not kind of isn't even the point. It's the fact that you've got this sense of security that they're going to deliver it, and you can see this document. And it's like they're passing the buck, right? This responsibility has been passed from the execs to the product person, who now holds all the responsibility themselves. And it's up to the product person to go deliver them this roadmap. When chances are it wasn't even their idea to make this roadmap in the first place. Ask any product manager, were they comfortable coming up with those dates that they put on the roadmap? Or were they kind of bullied into it? Were they kind of pushed into coming up with something because they had to have something to tell the execs and the other stakeholders who are asking about this thing? And the further out you go on that thing, the more that these dates are being made up. And so what tends to happen is you get in this vicious cycle where product managers are forced to make up something. And so they add some extra buffer. They add buffer to their dates because they want to prevent any slippage, right? Add some extra room so that things don't actually go wrong. And of course, what tends to happen when you have extra time to do work? Have you ever heard that old law, Parkinson's law. It says that work expands to fill the time given.
Yes.
And it's the same reason why, like, they're always running late on everything, right? Scope creeps, and there's always some last minute thing to add. You're always, procrastinating. And so you always end up late on something, regardless of how long you give it. And so your roadmap, even if you've added a ton of buffer, you always seem to be late on everything, right? I've never seen a roadmap that was actually delivered on time consistently. And so, regardless of how much buffer you add, everything's still late. You're still delivering stuff that has tech debt because you never have time to go back and actually rebuild and refactor and fix the stuff that you rushed out the door the last few sprints, the last few launches. And you erode the trust from your execs because you still can't deliver on time. You're still delivering junk. You're still not getting the right stuff. And so they create tighter controls, and they want to know why you're not hitting things on time. And it's creating this blame culture within the company. And so you add even more buffer, right? You're still expected to create these timelines. You add even more buffer, and your timelines get longer. And so this is how you get companies who started off as lean, but over time are just these gigantic teams who can't deliver anything, right? Have you ever seen some of these companies who are huge, like, government orgs, or, some of these much larger orgs who are going through often their transformation, and they take months and months and months to deliver something simple that a startup could go do in a fraction of that. They could deliver in a weekend. And it's because they're actually having to provide all this accountability upwards and all these extra controls, all this extra resource just in the planning, that they end up not being able to actually deliver nearly as fast as a much smaller company. And it's part of this vicious cycle that they're setting themselves up in that's leads directly back to this timeline, date-driven thinking.
Yeah, that is so spot on. I can't tell you how many times I've been in organizations, whether working directly in an organization or advising an organization, and their whatever timeline they put, as you say, it's I mean, really just made up, right? And there's sandbagging, as I call it, right? So if it's really a 50-hour type of feature, they say, oh, it's 100 hours,
Yeah.
That padding is real, but everyone in the organization knows it. And so there's this unspoken margin of error. So if somebody says it's going to be a month, everybody thinks, oh yeah, that's 2 months. Or, oh yeah, well, I know that's only a 2-week project that they're taking a month on, right? But everybody knows that it's this kind of nonsense that we do, but everybody just is okay with it because, like you said, it's just such a part of everything. Okay, so we've established that being tied down by this timeline is wrong, and certainly can bloat the organization and turn organizations into this almost bureaucracy that is not optimal. We've established that. I think everyone listening is probably going to agree with that. But now what? What do we do? How do we fix this? It's so embedded in everything that we do. What do we need to do to fix it?
Yeah, well, there's two ways that I see companies going with this. I mean, one thing that I've seen companies do is that they swing wildly in the other direction and they just do away with the roadmap, which isn't healthy. I know that companies went through this phase for a while where they just didn't have a roadmap, but what they did was try to go hyper agile and tried to build whatever sort of turned up in their backlog that was the noisiest, and they didn't get driven by anything particularly strategic. They didn't get driven by anything that helped them hit their objectives. And that's not healthy either, right? So you can't do away with the roadmap or any of this long-term thinking. It's healthy to rethink your roadmap, and there are ways to do that. The way that I think of the roadmap is as a prototype, but for your strategy. So the reason I think of that is when you're doing your when you're building a new feature, right? You don't go and build the first ever thing that pops into your head and send that straight to your engineering team and hope that it's the right thing, because almost certainly it's going to be less good than what it could have been, right? What you do is you scrap something down on a piece of paper or in a sketch file or whatever sort of prototyping tool you have, and then you share it with somebody, no matter how scrappy it is. And they tell you some feedback. They tell you to add some copy to make it more clear, add a button to help them figure something out. And you take that feedback and you adjust your prototype and you make it better. And over time, that feature, that interface, whatever you're trying to do, gets better at solving the problem at hand and becomes more sturdy, right? It becomes a better version of what it is that you're trying to articulate, what you're trying to solve. And we need to do the same thing for our strategy. And really, road mapping is a strategic process. It's a way that we articulate our strategy. And so the roadmap is a prototype for the strategy. So it's like prototyping, but at the strategic level. So what you're actually doing is you are taking all your assumptions about your strategy and you're just scrapping them down onto a piece of paper or into something really, really basic and saying, well, I think the problems in front of us or the opportunities in front of us or, the initiatives, the things we should try are these. I think it should go here, 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 and then here. Right? These are the stepping stones we could take. And they might be right, they might be wrong. They're probably wrong, and that's cool, right? Your first prototype also sucks. But what you do is you take it, you show it to somebody, and they give you feedback on it. And you show it to more people, and you get more feedback. And the more people you show it to, like in your team, outside your team, whoever will listen, the more you actually understand, the more that you can actually get feedback on your strategy, the more robust your strategy becomes. And what tends to happen is with a timeline roadmap is companies create a list of features and then just go blindly build this list of features, which is not strategic thinking. That's just building a list of features in whatever order in some sort of static way. What the roadmap can be used for is really thinking and strengthening your strategy through continuous feedback. And so each time you talk it out with somebody on your team, you're strengthening that strategy. So it can be a really powerful tool. And as a product leader, it's one of the most powerful things you can do is lead a good road mapping process, which is by getting the assumptions about the strategy out from your head and out from other people's heads in the business on paper or on something and having them share and figure out where those assumptions jive and where they clash. And then where they do work out together, that becomes your strategy, right? To make sure that you've got something that's cohesive and makes sense for the business.
I have to tell you, that's one of the my favorite things I've heard is that roadmap is a prototype for your strategy. My gosh, that is so it's so perfect, right? And I've never really thought about it in that way, and I'm sure lots of folks out there haven't either. That is such an insightful way to think about a roadmap because roadmaps, as you say, are important, but they've just become these vehicles that are not strategic, and that's what a roadmap should be. It should be an illustration of your strategy, if you will. And so I just really love the idea of approaching it that way and thinking about it as a living, breathing thing that just like any other prototype is going to evolve and become better over time. That's really, really cool. I love that.
Excellent. And it's important to remember that the roadmap is a separate document. It's a separate piece from your release plan. So a lot of people think about their roadmap as being the release plan because oftentimes, if you look up a roadmap on, Google image search, you get a bunch of Gantt charts and they look like mini release plans, little project plans, and they're not meant to be that. A release plan is a separate document. It's a tactical document. It's a project planning document. And it's still important to have release planning tactics. It's still important to have good release cadence and good habits, but that's separate from your road mapping. So don't hurt your road mapping capabilities by trying to mash it together with your release planning. Both should be strong capabilities that your company has and that you as a product manager are able to manage, but they should be two separate functions, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree with that. So have you seen organizations succeed in moving away from this timeline trap? Anything you can share with us in terms of, case studies and actually seeing folks succeed in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my work with both Mind the Product and with ProdPad in particular, I've seen thousands of companies take the step and move away from timeline roadmaps into something more lean. So we were the first to develop the now, next, later format of the roadmap. And when we got that out there in end of 2012, early 2013, some people took to it immediately like fish in water because it was natural to them, right? That concept of time horizons where things closer to you were more granular and things further away were less granular. It sort of makes sense in a very intuitive sense. Whereas others, it's like pulling teeth, right? It makes a big difference if you've got buy-in from execs, if the company is already product-led as opposed to sales-led or a little bit more of an agency model, or as we've learned a little bit in the last year, if they've had some sort of crisis and are ready to rethink the way that they work.
So, it's interesting to me, and I have long been a fan of the now next later model. So thank you for that, because I think it's so important for product managers to understand, and maybe even more importantly, product leaders to understand, right? As you said, that kind of intuitive way to look at the world and to look at our ongoing cadence of work. I think that's really awesome. So, and you mentioned there are some organizations out there that just don't get it, or it's hard for them to get it. So how do we, product managers, product leaders, how do we explain the move away from timelines, right? I can imagine it scares a lot of people because they just can't see how to work in another way. So how can we persuade them to see a different way if there's some sort of burden or some sort of hurdle to get some of the organization on this side of the fence? How do we go about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first step is to acknowledge that it's a problem and speak up about it, right? Sometimes it's a little bit of the emperor's wearing no clothes situation where everyone's just sort of doing it because, the last product manager did it and no one really wants to say anything different. And they're waiting for the product team to actually stand up and say, no, this isn't how modern product management works. The amount of product managers that I've seen who actually just change their roadmap at the next time the next board meeting or the next presentation of the roadmap, and they just totally get away with it because they say, this is how a roadmap works. This is how a roadmap is going to work from now on. And as long as it still solves the problem at hand, it works. Other times you might get faced with more resistance. So it's important to figure out what resistance that is, which stakeholders are giving that resistance, and working with them to figure out what their fear is and assuaging those fears, essentially. I've actually written a doc that sort of digs into all the different stakeholders and their common fears. But some of the common ones are things like, what execs or customers or investors, sales, marketing, what each of these might think. Like execs, your boss often wants the timeline roadmap because it gives them that sense of control and comfort that you're actually getting work done. Right? To them, it's almost a little checklist saying, hey, I know that the team is actually doing some stuff because I can see that the stuff is going to be done. Regardless of whether it actually means that more stuff is going to be done under this model or not, oftentimes explaining to them that the return on investment that they'll get from you working in a leaner way and being able to be experimentation driven is going to be much higher than if you try to make up a bunch of promises about what may or may not be built and waste a lot of time building in a whole lot of buffer. If they can see the difference between that, and oftentimes they do, then you can often make that case as to why you're going to make that switch. And sometimes it means asking for permission to get a little bit of leeway here and there, working on it for a small project or a small subset of the company to prove that the lean way is working. Sometimes it helps to have case studies. This lean thing is not new. There are case studies that stretch back 20 years now. So there's lots of examples to lean on as to why the lean experimentation driven approach is going to be more profitable for the business. And that's what you want to drive forward is, if you're talking to execs, is why this is going to be cost saving and more profitable for the business at the end of the day. When it comes to sales teams, often they want to look at the roadmap because they're looking forward to what they can actually sell. And it's worth having that conversation to point out that the job of the sales team, unless you're an agency, their job is not to sell something that doesn't exist yet. Their job is to sell what exists today. And if they're unable to sell what exists today, either your sales team is not good enough, or you need to really rethink as to what your product is and reposition it because you may not actually have a viable product. But more often than not, your sales team is just doing the easy thing, which is selling a product that doesn't exist, because it's easier than selling the product that does exist. And you've got to get them selling what does already exist. Otherwise, you're going to be constantly sales-led and always selling the next feature for whatever, and you're never going to be able to win back your discovery time. You're always going to be delivering. They're going to sell the month of August to this customer and the month of September to this other customer. If in doubt, what you can do is redeploy your salespeople to help you discover as to what's on this roadmap actually is going to be of value, not sell it, right? They're not supposed to come back and say, yeah, okay, somebody wants this thing and, I've sold it. They're now expecting it to be done by this date, but just help identify what things are going to be valuable or not. They can be hugely valuable to the product team, but they're not meant to sell things that don't exist. And if you find that you're in a company where the sales team is selling things that don't exist yet, congratulations, you work for an agency, not a product company, and you need to really rethink as to what kind of business model your business is actually building. And something similar goes for marketing. Marketing teams are really known for wanting to line up their marketing campaigns with your development launches, which is just a recipe for disaster, because you've got two unknown projects going side by side, and one hoping that the other one launches on time so that they don't waste a whole bunch of time and effort launching the other one. The easy answer there is to separate hard launch from soft launch, right? It's really easy nowadays to feature flag stuff, to launch things into some sort of staging or like a beta mode or some sort of feature flagged functionality area where something is finished. And at that point in time, you can tell marketing that they can begin their campaign planning, but they're no longer waiting on the development team to build out this feature and get the launch done on time for some launch. Once something is actually in some sort of soft launch mode, you can tell the marketing team that they can kick off whatever campaign. And if it takes them 6 hours or 6 days or 6 weeks or 6 months to plan the biggest, bangest launch that they want, they can take the time that they want. And now they have a functioning, viable, working feature that's hidden, but they can use that to test it with customers, get videos of it working, get testimonials, have all the collateral that they need to actually do this proper launch for it. So you separate your hard and soft launch, and you actually get a much better marketing launch out from it, and you're not risking that campaign launch from falling over if you didn't happen to launch the day that you promised marketing, some months ago when you started the kickoff in the first place. So it really depends on which. It really depends on which stakeholder you're talking to, but each one can be talked around to the sense of why a timeline roadmap is not good for business and why a lean way of working is going to be much better in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just about to say it's so important, just like all communication within the product management ecosystem, is to realize which audience you're speaking with at the moment and understand what's in it for them, right? I mean, we're all in this business together, and we all want to succeed. And if we can prove to them that there's a better way to succeed, again, there's a different means to the same end that we're all after, then we're more apt to get them on board. So great advice there. So I want to turn a little bit to something a little bit more maybe logistical. You mentioned earlier kind of the release planning not being the same thing as a roadmap, which of course is very, very true, but is also something that gets blurred a lot in organizations. And so a lot of times road mapping work, again, which is usually blurred into really what constitutes a release plan, is used for budget planning, right? So how do we either disconnect that, or how do we move away from, timeline road mapping work, and tying that to quarterly budget planning? How does this move away from timeline road mapping work with companies who do tie that to quarterly budget planning?
So when it comes to companies who want to use the roadmap for quarterly budget planning, this is where OKRs come into play, because OKRs, objectives and key results, are a great way to give management the ability to set the high-level goal as well as the budget that they're looking for and to set the direction for the team, and then allow the team to find ways to reach that goal by running the experiments, by being experimentation driven. So an example of this is think of a team that has that costs $1 million a year to run, and therefore each quarter it costs $250,000 to run. If they want to spend a quarter on a particular problem, then they can budget that particular quarter towards that problem. They can say that the conversion problem is worth spending a quarter on, and that budgets essentially that $250,000 on solving that problem. At that point in time, the team then knows that that's the most important problem to go solve, and the team can then go and find novel, interesting ways to go solve that problem. And their job is to find as many experiments as they need to break down that problem and to run those experiments from, early experiments through to finished either success or failures with results in order to hit the outcomes that they're looking for. And at the end of that quarter, once they've actually run those experiments, it might be that they've run 10 experiments or 20 or 50, depending on the size of the team and what their cadence is. But at the end of that, almost guaranteed, they will have made an impact of some sort on that objective. Certainly, they will have learned a lot about how to hit that objective. And that's certainly more than what you're going to get if you stood at the beginning of the quarter and tried to make up a list of features that you think were going to make that difference, right? What you're actually doing is you're giving the space for the team to learn and adjust throughout that quarter so that they don't know which experiments they're going to run, but that they have room to run as many experiments as they can. And after that quarter, they hit the end of that quarter, management can then turn around and say, great, so you moved that number to here, good job. The next most important thing to do that we're going to budget towards is now hitting this revenue goal. So we're going to budget $250,000 to go hit this revenue goal. Go run as many experiments as possible. And they now know that you can run 25 experiments per quarter. So they expect you to run maybe 25 experiments, maybe more, maybe less. That's not really the important thing here. But they have a sense as to how the team runs and what the process is. And over time, you have this cadence of just constantly running experiments towards hitting various goals. And management is able to set these top level goals and budgets, essentially. And the roadmap is there to help identify what these initiatives are that are going to impact these objectives and what sort of experiments are being run that are going to tie into these initiatives. And if you think about this is actually not that different to how other teams run. So put it this way, like a sales team, for example, a sales CRO or the VP sales doesn't stand at the beginning of the quarter and report to the execs or to the board that they're going to close a particular deal. They're not going to say that Acme Limited is going to buy the product for $1 million in March. They don't know that, right? What they do know is that they're going to run a bunch of experiments, and most likely they're going to get X number of dollars in sales. And by experiments, what I mean is that they're going to get their team of salespeople to pick up the phone or to pick up their emails and contact a bunch of people. They're going to try to reach out and get people to use things. And they're going to ask for a budget. They're going to say, I would like a budget of $250,000 so that I can have 10 or 20 salespeople on the phones running these experiments. Right? And they don't know which of those phone calls are going to land. They don't know which ones are going to work, which ones are not going to work. But they do know that if they continue to hammer the phones and run these experiments and learn from them, then eventually someone's going to pick up and buy the big package in March, right? And that's essentially how we want product to work. Marketing, same thing. You've ever heard that that saying that in marketing, half your ad dollars are wasted, you just don't know which half? Like marketing campaigns are essentially a series of experiments. No one is saying that they're going to spend $250,000 on, a bunch of campaigns and that's going to get, Jimmy in New York to go buy at this time. They're just going to say that we know that this, in general, we're going to get this sort of thing happening, this uplift over here. There's no guarantee on the specifics, but they do know the process and the sort of uplift that they're expected to get. And that's what we expect. That's what we hope that we can get and communicate for product people as well.
Yeah, such an important perspective, and I think that's just such a good way to explain it, and a good way to look at it is that business runs this way in so many other functions, even if we don't think about it in that way, and product can and should as well. So great advice there. So final question I have for you. A lot of companies, we've talked a little bit about this theme. A lot of companies might have a fear of moving away from deadlines because those deadlines are really the only thing that keeps work moving forward on time for them. It's just part of their corporate DNA. How do you get those companies on board to this idea?
Yeah. The thing is that a lack of deadlines in your timeline roadmap doesn't mean that your team isn't driven. It's still important to have internal deadlines like personal goals like I hope to achieve this by this particular time. That's going to be my own milestone. It's important that team members have those sorts of goals. It's important to have things like time boxing. These are all important tools to make sure that your team isn't going into deep rabbit holes and getting lost in their work unnecessarily. It's there to help keep them accountable to themselves and to each other. But it's important not to give these arbitrary, made-up deadlines that are coming from above as this list of preset requisites that need to be done. And that's what we're doing away with here. We're not doing away with the focus on getting work done in any sort of pace. And as a matter of fact, there should really be a focus on creating a way of working that does create a nice, even pace to get things done, right? So you don't actually need the arbitrary deadlines that much. So instead of, for example, instead of having gargantuan releases where you have to almost bid to get your work in, or race to get your work in each quarter or whenever these things come out, just have a regular release cadence, right? If you have a release that goes out every day or every week or whenever it is, right, a regular release train, if you miss it, if you didn't get your code out on time because it wasn't perfect, you needed to actually fix something here to make sure that there wasn't tech debt for the next developer to open it up. Cool. Well, you can work on it for an extra day or so, and you'll just put it into the next one. And there's no big deal with having something delayed by a day or an hour or a week or whatever. And it means that some things might end up going out faster because you're not just trying to build to particular deadlines. You're not creating a whole bunch of tech debt that otherwise might hold you back. And the thing is that teams aren't driven by those deadlines that you put up on that roadmap. That isn't what's driving them. The team is driven by the prospect of getting something interesting at the door, seeing something that they made make an impact with the customers. And they should be able to see the stuff that they made make an impact with those customers. That should be transparent to them. And they then should be able to go work on the next thing. That should be exciting to them. And so this way of working just provides more autonomy. It provides a better work environment. And, frankly, when it's as competitive as it is now, it's so important to the business to not drive your team away with these 20-year-old project-led working practices. There's a much better way of working that's going to provide better quality code, better quality work, and keep your team on board with you.
Yeah, I was just going to mention the fact that, today's, employee is not the same one of 20 years ago. And if anything, the last 18 months or so of being in this kind of crazy pandemic world has hastened. It's the fact that, employees want a great environment. And there's no question that kind of a value-driven approach rather than an arbitrary deadline driven approach is definitely going to be more rewarding for employees. So I love that you brought that up because I couldn't agree more. That's another one of those things that I think we can use, especially to talk to leadership around the organization to help, sway them to move in this direction. So this has just been such a great conversation. Thank you so much, Janna, for sharing your insights with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for inviting me on.
Yeah, it was a great time. Thank you again. And thank you all for joining us on Masters of Product Management, powered by Sequent Learning Networks. I am JJ Rory, and I look forward to speaking with you on the next episode.
You've been listening to Masters of Product Management, powered by Sequent Learning Networks. If you'd like to take your career to the next level with additional tools, training, coaching, and books, Be sure to visit Sequent Learning Networks at sequentlearning.com.